Hello, I'm Michael Webrow, and in this video I'm going to talk to you about Firebase Authentication. So, Firebase Authentication provides us with a useful, easy way of handling sign-in for users. And this is across a variety of different types of login and platforms. You can do anonymous authentication where no username or password are provided, and an app is just able to connect to a Firebase database and you can control everything else. You can do email-based sign-in where a user signs up with an email address and a password, and then they have to re-enter that same username and password on other devices. You can allow sign-in via a Google account. You can also allow sign-in via Apple sign-in, though this requires an Apple paid developer account, so we won't cover that in the unit. And you can see on the right, there's a number of sign-in providers, things like Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, Microsoft, etc. And this is all nice because it automatically handles things like password resets, user verification, etc. So, how do we use it? The first thing we need to do is we call a lot of these methods via a class called auth, which is our auth controller in Firebase. And you'll notice here it's an optional. Part of the reason for this is that we need to make sure that Firebase is loaded and configured at the time. For brevity in the following slides, I'm assuming it's not an optional and just calling it without any optional chaining or any optional binding or anything like that. So let's have a look at a simple example of registering a new user. So we call a method on the auth controller called createUser. We give it an email address and a password, both strings, and then this is an async method. And as a result, it can either throw or return us a value, an auth result. So in this case, we dispatch it as part of a new task. We put it in a do catch block so we can catch the error and get back the auth result. Now, how this works is there's a number of different errors, and the errors can be things like authentication is not configured, or things like there exists another user with this email address with a different password, things like that. If you get to this point in yellow here, it means the user was signed in correctly, and if you get to here, some kind of error went wrong. So again, this method, like many other ones, or most functions or methods in Firebase, are asynchronous because they're doing work interacting with a server. So you can't just call them and assume that you have an immediate result. It has to be done as part of a task where you then write code that updates the UI in response. And one other thing to note about creating a user is it creates a user. If it's successful, it also signs them in. If you are signing in a user any other time apart from account creation, there's a method of the auth controller called sign-in. Again, it's an asynchronous method, and we provide the username and password, and it can either throw an error if, for example, the username and password are wrong and don't match, or if you get to this point, the statement following without any error being thrown, then you have the auth result and the user will be logged in. One thing to note about this is this state is remembered, so the next time you launch an app where the user has signed in before, their sign-in status will be that they remain signed in until some sign-in expires or they sign out via a sign out button. We can also sign in anonymously if saving the user details is not important. And in this case, it's kind of like the sign-in is just tied to the app instance on a particular device. So, if I sign in on an iPhone 13 and then I also have an iPhone 9, then that second device, I won't be able to sign into the same account because I don't know the details of how it was signed in. It will just end up as its own instance, like basically a new user tied to that device. The sign-in looks pretty much the same. We just ask it to sign in anonymously, and we either get a result or we get an error. Now, one of the things you realistically need to do is you need to listen for state changes, as in the user signing in or signing out, and handle this by going back to a login screen, or if you're at a login screen, transitioning to the normal first start page of your app. So how we do this is via a method called add state did change listener to the auth controller, and this is a closure that gets called every time the state changes. So this will happen the very first time they sign in. If they then click a sign out button, it would get called again. It also gets called at application launch. So the very first time you're entering the app, they don't need to actually click the sign in button. If they're already signed in, this will trigger once for us, which is quite nice. A bit like the listeners that we wrote for our data model in the previous labs, where when you first set up the listener, it called the callback and you got the results of whatever it was, the team of superheroes or something like that. So what are we doing here? If the view appears in our view controller, and we're calling this super implementation, and we're calling this add state did change listener, and this yellow part, as I said, it's a closure. This gets called asynchronously, so not immediately, but whenever the state changes, and it gives you back an auth result and a user, and then you can check whether they're signed in or signed out and do something with that, and we'll see in the lab classes a bit more about that, and also in the workshop. In terms of the other sign-in types, we won't cover Google sign-in, Facebook, Apple sign-in, Microsoft, but there's details on them and specifically how they work with iOS. The other thing that might be interesting to you is Firebase offers a pre-built UI for sign-in, which might be interesting for you as well, which you can find details of here. Okay, thanks for watching.